Well, today we're going to look at a vehicle that really typified the Ford styling look of the late 1970s into early 1980s. And that is, I'm going to call it the 1980 to 1984 Town Car. Yes, the 1980 Town Car was really a sub-series of the Continental, and in 1981 it became its own model. But the vehicle was effectively the same. And let's describe it in detail. So you're looking at a 1983 Lincoln Town Car here. Now, bear in mind that this was quite a radical departure from the Continental Town Cars and the Continentals that preceded it, that ended in the 1979 model year. Those vehicles were huge, 127-inch wheelbases, 4,700 pounds, enormous vehicles. However, interestingly, one could say that the styling was relatively dated on those huge vehicles. But amazingly, or perhaps not, the Continental as well as the Mark V sold extremely well throughout their entire model run, in particular the Mark V, which is a very expensive vehicle for the time. It was outselling the Cadillac Eldorado. So Lincoln was really loath to downsize their vehicles. General Motors had downsized most of its full-size vehicles for the 1977 model year. And it really took until 1980 for Lincoln to give it up and go to this downsized Panther platform for the, I'll just call it the Town Car. Hopefully people will forgive me for not calling the 1980 version the Continental Town Car, but we're just going to call these the Town Cars. So it's quite a revolutionary vehicle for Ford, certainly not revolutionary for the industry, and it moved to a completely new platform, the Panther platform. Now, when it came to the styling department, this Lincoln did depart from tradition in a number of, I won't call them radical ways, but in a number of ways. First thing that you can see is that the headlamps went from being concealed to exposed. And I suspect that was for reliability as well as cost reasons. But these were Lincolns that had obviously exposed headlamps through their entire model run. They never had the hidden headlights. And in fact, Lincoln would actually do something rather advanced with headlights, and in 1984 would have the first kind of composite lenses for headlamps on the Mark VII. But another piece of interesting styling choice here is that notice that the fender tops and the overall vehicle don't have a chrome molding running atop the vehicle here. And that was very typical of Lincolns for a number of years. Here abandoned, perhaps for style as well as cost. And again, I'm just hypothesizing. Ford Motor Company wasn't doing all that well from a financial standpoint in the late 70s and early 1980s. And so my guess is that they were trying to conserve some costs in addition to preserving the overall look of the car. Now, as we continue looking at this vehicle from the front three-quarter view, let's pick out some very interesting styling choices. First, you have that perfectly flat fender. Again, a very, very Ford trait. You have the turn signal indicator that is, and parking lamp that's integrated into the front fender, very much like the Mark V. Obviously, you have the Rolls-Royce style grille like the Mark V 4.3 before it, and also like the Mark VI, let's say. Ooh, the Mark VI. We'll talk about that one another day. But look at how flat that fender profile is, and because the bottom part of the fender kind of has this rise to it, notice that the portion of the fender with the cornering lamp is higher than the portion of the fender behind the front wheel. It gives the feeling that somebody almost took this car and picked it up by the front bumper and jerked it, and the front is kind of pointing upward a little bit. It's not an attractive look, and I don't know about anybody else, but that really does bother me. And this is a styling disease that afflicted a number of Fords. It's just something, it's a trick that your eyes are playing on you, that because of this flat surface, it views it as pointing upward. It would have perhaps been a bit better to have a more gentle lead-in, kind of like the Mark IV. The Mark IV, the fender profile rises very gradually. A lot of GM and Chrysler vehicles had that too, but Ford just loved this absolutely flat profile, flat belt line, and that was the Gene Bourdonnais era of style for Ford. Next, let's go to the side profile, and this is where I admittedly shudder a bit. Take a look at the wheelbase here, and while this car still has a relatively large 117-inch wheelbase, it was downsized 10 inches versus the previous generation. And to me, it, as my friend John Manoogian would say, has kind of the hippo on a bar stool look. The wheels don't look like they're pushed far enough out to the corners. Now, one would say that rear overhangs during this period and before were somewhat in vogue. But the front overhang was something that was really a Ford design trait. GM and Chrysler, they generally tried to push the front axle farther forward, so you had some dashed axle. This is almost set up such that the overhangs are symmetrical front to rear. And Ford was doing this not only during the 80s era, but they had been doing it, I would say even the Mark IV has it, the Mark V certainly has it, huge overhangs. I don't know that that's an elegant proportion. It just doesn't look like the car is stable when you see it from this side view. And I suspect during design reviews that designers were trying to walk relatively quickly around this dead-on side profile. Again, you can see this super flat fender, the flat belt line, perfectly flat almost. And you have the drag section lower rocker that really, again, it's like a clay modeler could just drag a template across that and form that surface below that very large and rather awkward looking molding that you see there at the bottom of the door, kind of covering up the crease, which I don't necessarily care for either. Now, a couple other interesting things about this vehicle. One, this was the first Lincoln, at least in some time in the relatively modern history when this was introduced, to have framed doors, not the frameless door glass. So you can see that the designers chose to black those out. And it also has the mini vents, the little vent window ahead of the power window. When you push the power window switch, that mini vent would go down first and the bigger window would drop. But it has a fixed portion, that mini vent, the back portion with the divider bar. That divider bar is fixed. On the earlier Fords that had mini vent windows, that divider bar went down with the front pane of glass. And they sometimes separated, and Ford had trouble with them. So I think that this design was better. You also obviously see the half toupee vinyl roof, never a favorite of mine. I can't think of a car where the half toupee looks good, but it was in vogue and it was a trend certainly during this era. You do also have the wire wheel covers on these vehicles that have the hexagonal nut style center that came out on the Mark IIIs that was really patterned off of wheels from the 1920s on cars like Rolls-Royces and Packards. But Lincoln revived that for the Mark III, and it became a very popular wheel design, not only for Ford, but also for others. I think even Buick used something similar on their wire wheel covers in the 1980s. But that's where it kind of traced its heritage to those true classic vehicles of the 1920s era. But Lincoln really gets credit for reviving that on their, in 1969 on the Mark III, it was on like a turbine vane disc. And by this point, it had propagated to the faux wire wheel covers, if you will. Lastly, I'll point out in side profile that it's almost as though the designers really wanted that symmetry front and rear. And I mentioned the symmetry of the overhangs, or relative symmetry, but notice the wheel arches are quite symmetrical as well, as is the style of the parking lamp up front and the tail lamp out back. So I guess designers just wanted you to think the front is the rear and the rear is the front. Even the rake of the windshield and the rake of the backlight is relatively similar. So clearly they were going for that as a theme. I don't know that it necessarily works, but hey, what do I know? These cars sold very well, so I guess people liked it. Now, as we rotate around to the rear three-quarter view, we can see the tail lamps. And on these 1980 to 1984 town cars, they have these very vertical style tail lamps. This would be revised for the 1985 model year. I guess if I had to pick a town car, I'd go with these from a style perspective, though from a mechanical perspective, I would want a 1989 town car, kind of the last of this generation. But if I had to pick, I like the symmetry, I guess, in the very vertical lamp and how the tail lamp here is really a continuation of the form of the quarter panel. Now notice in between the two tail lamps, you have kind of a 3-box section area there with lights. That 3-element theme was employed on Lincolns for a number of years, though often in the tail lamps themselves. So if you take a look at my 1972 Continental as an example, you'll see that 3-lamp theme and the tail lamps left and right, a total of 6 lights. Here, Lincoln kept that theme, but they just did it in one and helped accentuate the width of the vehicle, which was somewhat needed because this car was downsized and you have a very vertical theme to the car front and rear. I'll also point out one detail which I never quite understood, and that is for many years, the Lincoln symbol on the trunk lock was different from the regular Lincoln symbol that was introduced on the Mark III. I don't know why. I suspect it's because that very vertically oriented Lincoln symbol that I mentioned that started with the Mark III was just not, didn't look good on the trunk locks because it took up so much vertical space that perhaps they devised an alternate logo. But I did find it weird that they were okay with just kind of perturbing the dimensions of their logo. It's still Lincoln E, but it really only appears on trunk lock covers during this era, and I'm not quite sure why Ford designers felt the need to do that. And from the dead-on rear view, we can see those three elements that I mentioned before in between the two taillights. And here again, you got the battering ram bumper out back, similar to the prior generation. And during this time frame, I think Ford and others would get better at integrating the bumpers into the vehicles. But this is a very old school style integration where the bumper sits very proud of the sheet metal with this rubber flubber urethane piece kind of covering the gap. Not very attractive. Imagine if this bumper were smaller and more tailored to the body. I think it would have given it a better look, but oh well, that's the way that it is. Now also take a look at the backlight here. One of the things that I guess is a little bit surprising is Ford went with the half vinyl toupe roof on these, but they didn't really French in the backlight or make it have a look of greater privacy. It's just a full width back glass. And that was not typical for luxury cars during the time frame. Like I said, most of them, think about like the 1978 Cadillac Eldorado, or even the generation afterward, the 79 to 85 Eldorado. That rear window was kind of enclosed a little bit. It had, it was a smaller dimension, at least from what you could see out of, than other cars, just lending an air of privacy and exclusivity to the vehicles, but not here on the Lincoln Town Cars. Now let's turn inside for a second, because just like the outside, where it was very boxy and also had some elements of cost cutting, you kind of have the same here. Now, first thing is, this is obviously faux wood grain. No trees died, or at least real trees died in the construction of this instrument panel or the steering wheel horn pad. But the wood grain in Ford that Ford used during this time frame, I thought was actually pretty good. But notice how boxy everything is. It's like a bunch of picture frames all over, and it goes with the overall theme of the car. I bet the designers hated that they had to have a round steering wheel. But there are some curious elements of cost savings here. One I will point out, which I definitely did not like, was the tilt steering wheel, where just the steering wheel tilts and rotates. The column actually does not move. It is fixed. I never really liked this design. I just thought it was not what I would have hoped for. If I were a buyer and I was thinking I was getting a tilt steering wheel, I would be used to the column moving up and down like it did on older Fords, but my guess is this was a cost savings move on this Lincoln. At least the gauges do have kind of this three-dimensional look. That middle rectangle there in the center of all three of those gauges is set closer to the driver, and so it does give them a little bit of depth and dimension that I really miss in modern cars that have these electronic screens. It's just very two-dimensional when you have an electronic screen versus three-dimensional with something like this. Now let's take a look at the door panel, because this is another curious mix of somewhat expensive with cost savings. The first thing is there's lots of vacuum forming and I'll call it artificial, not really stitching, because sometimes you'll see artificial stitches that are pressed into the vinyl that are not real stitches, especially on cars of this era. But here the designers didn't even try to kind of fake that stitch look. It just has these various molded shapes associated with it. Notice, for instance, the molded rectangle that is part of the armrest on the underside of the armrest. That's just there for design. There's no reason for it other than that. Probably just looked too plain without it. And then also in the pull handle, the middle of that area, you can see like a crease that runs around the door panel. Again, it's just kind of stamped into the vinyl. There is no stitching on this door panel anywhere. It does have a carpeted lower kick panel, which was quite nice, and some chrome trim and some faux wood grain. It's not an overly cheap door panel, but again, no stitching, though it does, again, have some fine details as well as some bright work on it. And here we go. This is a top down of the same door panel, and you'll notice what I'm talking about, that there's all these molded shapes in the vinyl, but no stitching. I still think it's an elegant door panel and an overall elegant theme. And this interior, as we transition to here, it's quite sumptuous. It's a comfortable place to be. These are comfortable cars to drive. And having driven them, I can tell you that they do ride very, very well. These Panther platform cars do have great road isolation. They are very quiet, I would say, on the road. The only real letdown in these Panther platform cars comes under hood. And that's in the form of the engines, but less so the engine and the Ford automatic overdrive or AOD transmission. I can't get used to the AOD transmissions, especially if you're used to C6s and turbohydromatic 400s and Chrysler 727 torque flights. The C6 was never a smooth shifter. In fact, I hesitate to call many old school Ford transmissions smooth shifting. The Cruise-O-Matic wasn't all that smooth. The FMX, the C6, the C4, they all were relatively harsh shifting. But the AOD, it's like it just wants to go into overdrive too quickly, and it's hunting between gears. So that is not necessarily my favorite Ford transmission. And then you have a series of different 5-liter V8s under hood in these town cars. And in some cases, it depended upon whether or not this was a U.S. or Canada vehicle, if it had a carburetor or if it had throttle body fuel injection during these years. Now, I would say GM throttle body injection of the early 80s was actually pretty robust and reliable. The Ford setup here I would not call quite as good. Certainly better than the carburetor, but the throttle body setup on these did have some issues with the engine sensors, and I don't think was as great as what General Motors was offering at the time. Now, I will say if you're going to get one of these and you get a 1988, 1989 especially, where you get the 5-liter multi-port injected V8, those cars are 200,000 plus mile vehicles. They are super reliable, and so long as you like the styling, it's hard to beat from a reliability perspective. They're just great vehicles the latter years of these town cars, and they're quiet, they're smooth, they have great road isolation. So I know I was a little bit harsh on the styling. It's not necessarily my aesthetic, but that's me. Who cares? If you like it and you enjoy it, get one. They're nice cars, they're reliable, they're good to drive. So it's just something that isn't my particular cup of tea, but oh well. Let me know what you think about this review of the town car. Thanks again for watching.